I asked the questions about where he died, at his desk, in the office, or working, having a little fun in his townhouse, and also who was with him. Was it the security guard and a chauffeur, or was he alone with Megan Marshack, who hesitated to call the ambulance for 1 hour? And I also asked questions about Dr. Ernest R. Eshikoff, and did Rockefeller really have heart trouble, or was he exhumed in a hurry to hide something about that death? Of course, in listing the possible motives for killing Nelson Rockefeller, I ran out of space on the page because I wanted to ask some other questions about Megan Marshack, and I listed a few possible motives on the sheet that you have and on the tape last week. And the really primary motive I didn't go into. I'm going to go into that today, because the big answer, of course, in the political scene, in changing political offices, is the Ronald Reagan connections, the person who's going to run for president in 1980. And I believe that Ronald Reagan was that selected agent, just as Richard Nixon was selected in 1946, and then finally became the President of the United States much later, was inaugurated in 1969. I believe that Ronald Reagan was selected a long time ago to be president, and anybody who stands in his way can be eliminated. And Reagan is now campaigning on a big scale, and we'll go into that more in a few minutes. Before I get into the Rockefeller story, I do want to mention an update for you. The House Committee, the Subcommittee on Health, the very important committee in the House of Representatives, there were several people vying for chairmanship. One was Representative Richardson Pryor, who was on the House Select Committee to investigate assassinations, who has tremendous family holdings and wealth in Merrill Richardson Drug Company. And he was trying very hard to get this seat, and he lost out. It was a bitter fight, described in the Washington Post, January 31st, 1979, won out by Representative Henry A. Waxman, a Democrat from California. And the seniority system went off in this case, that there was a bitter fight of conflict of interest and so forth. And Mr. Waxman is a liberal, somebody who will make important decisions. Sometimes the head of these subcommittees seems so minute that it's hard to realize how they affect our everyday life. But when you get a person who is a liberal, who is concerned about smoking statistics or cancer and general health, health insurance, clean air standards, hospital costs, and so forth, it makes a big difference who heads those committees. Richardson Pryor was charged, as I say, of having ownership in drug company stock. He's been attacked for his position with the American Cancer Society, criticizing the statistics on smoking and defending the smoking, the people that manufacture the cigarettes. This is an important balance here that was fighting the Waxman Pryor for. They were fighting for the head of this subcommittee on health, this key committee. And I'm very happy to say that there is good news sometimes before we get into the gloomier side of life. And those of you that wrote letters, some of you might have, I did, about this conflict of interest with Richardson Pryor. I think that you can feel better about this now. At least there's a decent man, Representative Henry A. Waxman, who's going to head that subcommittee, and I think that this will make a difference. I hope it will. When I was doing college lectures, the question would come out often, how about the power of Rockefeller? What is the base of Rockefeller? And I kept saying over and over again that Rockefeller is a problem. Goodness knows he is a problem. But the big problem, in my mind, was Ronald Reagan and the men behind Ronald Reagan and the power of Ronald Reagan. And I think it's interesting to see the way Reagan is stepping up his campaign now that Rockefeller is gone, particularly with all the mysteries that are involved in the death of Rockefeller. There's just as many mysteries as there were in many other deaths that took place: the John Kennedy assassination, Robert Kennedy's murder, the Chappaquiddick affair, the shooting of George Wallace, the killing of Mary Jo Kopechne. The Rockefeller demise is for the same purposes, and the same people will achieve it, and it's covered up by the same teams, and I'd like to go into that in more detail with you right now and answer some of the questions that I asked last week. I asked the question, who is Megan Marshack, and then gave a list of questions, and we'll go into those now because it's 1 week later and there's a little bit more information about her. I think that Rockefeller got what we call the Chappaquiddick affair. In the first place, the family is all quieted because a woman was involved. So they're not going to ask who did him in or how. His wife is in seclusion. Harvey Rockefeller and all of the family, I'm sure, are terribly embarrassed. And there's a hands-off policy. Nobody is talking about this. As a matter of fact, on Good Morning America, Robert Hardman didn't talk or interview people involved in the Rockefeller murder, death, but he had Rhoda Barrett talking about it as if Nelson Rockefeller were a Hollywood star. Here's the head of the Chase Manhattan Bank, the governor of New York for 4 terms, an important man on the Council of Foreign Relations, and with his brother David Rockefeller had handpicked Jimmy Carter to be president and part of their trilateral organization. And he was relegated, not only was he vice president, but he was relegated to the movie star status this morning with Rhoda Barrett talking about the mysteries of Rockefeller and the fact that he would have lived if an ambulance had been called earlier, or probably would have. And she introduced the subject as saying nobody is beyond investigation these days. There's no such thing as private lives. So the Rockefeller matter on Good Morning America was relegated to the level of being like an Elvis Presley or movie star, that kind of gossip in Hollywood. It came from Hollywood, not from the centers of power like Washington, D.C. or New York City. Well, the Chappaquiddick affair, the similarity is by using a woman, or 2 women. In this case, there's 2 women, Conchita Pierce and Megan Marshack. I misspelled her name last week. It has a C in it. I'm sorry. On the list, I had S-H-A-K. It has a C in there. By using women, the family's embarrassed. And again, I have always reiterated the country is run by either bullets or blackmail, and every election is determined, and even non-election years, but elections by bullet or blackmail. So Rocky didn't have to be shot, just get him involved with a woman, and even if he were poisoned with Jim Jones type of cyanide, we would never know because they hurried up the cremation. The effect is the same at Chappaquiddick in 1969. It seemed that Ted Kennedy could easily beat Richard Nixon in 1972. The polls were already going, and that was the talk that Ted would run in 72. And while Nelson Rockefeller wouldn't run in 1980 for President of the United States, the people that he would run are pushed aside now. Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, and Reagan is recruiting the Ford people into his camp heavily, and in the next 3 weeks he'll be setting up his offices, pulling all the Ford people to Reagan now that Rockefeller isn't there to support Ford. It's just that simple. And the man that managed Gerald Ford is now gone. It's interesting that Gerald Ford was out here at Pebble Beach at the golf tournament the weekend that Rockefeller died, and he went to New York for the funeral and then flew back and was photographed in the Monterey Herald partying as usual. I have never seen the death of a public figure handled so callously. Jimmy Carter partying at the Kennedy Center and at the White House in tuxedo, and everybody having a ball. It was as if Nelson Rockefeller hadn't touched their lives in any way, even though he was behind Carter, behind Ford. The only person who showed any affect or grief was Henry Kissinger, and I can imagine why. But it was just a total blank in terms of anyone identifying with Nelson Rockefeller as having been on planet Earth or having left planet Earth. And I think that's really interesting, the way his close friends reacted to his death. It was parties as usual, quick and hurry, cremate him, get it over with, and let's get back. Now, as far as the Chappaquiddick affair and the Rockefeller affair, the Megan Marshack connections and the Conchita Pierce, the other woman involved, the one that Megan telephoned when Rocky passed out, and we'll go to that in a little bit. They're quiet. You haven't seen them. They're not interviewed. They're not available. At the time at Chappaquiddick, all the boiler room girls were flown off the island. They weren't seen, they weren't accessible, and they became non-persons. There wasn't any court trial. There was an inquest that was very quiet and published, but they were non-persons. And so far, Conchita Pierce and Megan Marshack are just like the Chappaquiddick boiler girls. They're just out of the way. And Megan will be moving back to California. She was planning to move there 2 weeks before this happened, and stated she'd be back in California, again Reagan country, the home of J. Walter Thompson and Ronald Reagan and Donald Segretti in the Dirty Tricks Department. If you recall earlier, the political events that were shaped by California that affect Washington. So the boiler room girls can split up. We won't hear from them. At the time at Chappaquiddick, Ted Kennedy was with a chauffeur who was at the island assisting him, and Nelson Rockefeller had a chauffeur, Mr. Hoffman, who was first reported with him and then wasn't with him. Evidently, he disappeared and returned again and was there when the ambulances arrived. The chauffeur was involved in Chappaquiddick because he came over the island with Senator Ted Kennedy, but Kennedy drove home alone, leaving the chauffeur in the cottage. And in this case, the chauffeur was supposed to be summoned by Conchita Pierce, of all people, but was never seen again and hasn't been seen again, and no interviews, and he was parked around the corner a block away, but except for his name being mentioned, there's not a sign of him around, at least as of this point. There was no autopsy of Mary Jo Kopechne. I had called her parents back there and told them to have an autopsy, that she could have been poisoned because she had passed out earlier and was in the back of the car when the car went over the bridge. But it was years later that they said they were sorry they didn't do the autopsy on her. But there was no autopsy on Nelson Rockefeller, and as I say, it was cremated 1 day ahead of time. They couldn't even keep it around that extra day. There are discrepancies in the news coverage of what the people were doing and their purposes of getting together at Chappaquiddick, and there were obviously discrepancies in the news coverage of what they were doing with Nelson Rockefeller. In fact, Hugh Murrow, the press secretary, went to Miss Marshack's home, Megan Marshack's home, at 4 a.m. after Rockefeller was declared officially dead at 12:30. He was at her home. We don't know whether he went with her right from the hospital to her place, but he was there when the Associated Press called at 4 a.m. From Washington, D.C., because she had worked for them for 6 months. And they were obviously planning their cover-up. And then Mr. Morrow had told the world that Rocky had died at his desk and he had been with his chauffeur and bodyguard. Then he said he'd been with his bodyguard and Miss Marshack. And he had said Miss Marshack was 31, and then it was 21, and then they compromised for a nice middle 25. He was with her. She took the ambulance right to the hospital, and then the long aide of Nelson Rockefeller's was with her, so there didn't have to be any discrepancies. And yet at Chappaquiddick, the stories of the boiler room girls, the girls that were loyal to John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy, the employees for the Kennedy campaign. Actually, Mary Jo Kopechne had worked for Smothers, long cohort of Bebe Rebozo and Richard Nixon, George Smothers, and Florida. And the background of these women was never exposed as being infiltrators into the camp and not actually working for Ted Kennedy's campaign or Robert Kennedy's campaign at all. Another similarity between Chappaquiddick and Nelson Rockefeller is that Mary Jo Kopechne would have lived if Ted Kennedy had called for help. There were lights on in homes. He passed the homes and walked down the road and then went back from the island to the mainland, and there was an air bubble in the top of the car, and she could have lived an hour. And it is now confirmed that Nelson Rockefeller would have lived if they'd called the emergency, but he passed out at 10:15, and it was 11:15 before anybody was called. And even then, they didn't mention it was Rockefeller. They might have gotten there 1 minute faster, but I doubt it. They got there pretty fast. And that extra hour would have made a difference in the life of Mary Jo Kopechne and Nelson Rockefeller. The doctors will have secrets, medical secrets. On Nelson Rockefeller, they say, the doctor I mentioned last week said that he had a history of heart disease, and then the news media and the doctor previously said he had only missed 3 days of work in his entire life and was never sick. And as I said last week, I'm sure that the medical records of the cardiograph or the heart disease of the day he diagnosed it are non-existent, just like all the records and files of Chappaquiddick are not existent. So I call this Rockefeller's Chappaquiddick affair. What we know is that Rockefeller was with Megan Marshack at 9 o'clock. He called her and told her to come over. She didn't have very far to go because he was at 13 West 54th Street and she was at 25 West 54th Street. It was just like 2 doors away on the same side of the street, and she came running over in her black gown, and when he called her at 9 p.m., there's no indication that anybody was around. His chauffeur was parked around the corner on another block on 55th Street, and he called her, come on over, and she came running in her little black gown. At 10:15, she was there from 9 to 10:15, Megan called Conchita Pierce. Now that's a big part of the mystery that just came out this week since we did the tape last week, because she didn't call 911, the emergency. But here is the catch. She called Conchita Pierce to get Rockefeller's chauffeur, who was parked on 55th Street. Now, why would Conchita, a woman television actress working for a television program, who's a roommate of Megan's, I can see where she would call her for help. But why would she know where Rockefeller's chauffeur was? That's pretty funny that at least Megan wouldn't know, or Rockefeller wouldn't say when he was gasping, or she couldn't run out on the street and try to find him herself. There was a doorman outside, and she didn't run out to get the chauffeur. So one of the big question marks is, who is Conchita Pierce that she knows where Rockefeller keeps his chauffeur? Is she the control of Megan Marshack? Because Marshack has to go to her for help. You get Rocky's chauffeur. And so then the question is, what does Conchita know about this affair that Megan doesn't know? She's left alone in the house with Rocky, but she won't call emergency for 1 hour, and she won't get his bodyguard wherever they are. There were 2 of them. And she won't get the chauffeur, but Conchita knows where the chauffeur is. The officers arrived, 2 officers arrived 11:18. 11:22, he was dead but warm, and they said he would have probably lived if they had called at 10:15. When the men arrived, a security guard of Rockefeller's was there by the name of Andrew Hoffman. And Andrew Hoffman is an important part of this story because he insisted that the paramedics take Rockefeller to Lennox Hospital instead of the nearest hospital. There was St. Clair Hospital, where the medics had come from, and the Roosevelt Hospital. But he insisted Hoffman was there when the medics arrived. So somewhere between 10:15, when Rocky was passed out or could be injected with a poison, one of these cyanide, Chappaquiddick poison in a food or a drink, or he could have been injected like the Jonestown and quietly just passed away in 5 minutes. But in the interim of 10:15 to 11:15, Hoffman had to appear. He wasn't with her when he passed out, or Hoffman would have called the emergency or the chauffeur right away, the bodyguard. So he took a powder with the chauffeur who was parked a block away, and he appears at 11:15. When the medics are there and the ambulance comes, he's in the room. So the question is, where was Andrew Hoffman from 9 to 11:15? That's a very important question to ask this week. And did this same woman, Conchita Pierce, know where he was? When she summoned the chauffeur didn't appear, and they didn't use Rocky's car. Hoffman appeared, his security guard, Andrew Hoffman. And I wonder what kind of a security guard he is, how long he worked for them. Remember, Thane Caesar was a security guard for Robert Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy was shot from behind, and Thane Caesar shot bullets from behind and has been charged by the researchers, not the courts, as having killed Robert Kennedy with a bullet 1 inch to the back of the head, and he's still at large. So the question is, where did Hoffman come from? How long did he work for Rockefeller? Because he took control from Megan. It went from Megan to Conchita Pierce, who allegedly called the chauffeur, but no chauffeur was on the premise in the room. But Hoffman shows up, security guard Hoffman, who orders the body to Lennox Hospital. And when the body goes to Lenox Hospital, it is admitted by Dr. Ernest Esikoff. And as of the timing of this tape, February the 9th, there is no record of who sent Dr. Esikoff to Lenox Hospital or when he was called. The question is, did Conchita call Esikoff and say, go to Lenox Hospital, or did she call him as soon as they heard Rocky had the heart attack so that Rocky would be received by Dr. Ernest Esikoff? That is the mystery that has to be solved. Who called Esikoff and told him to meet them at Lenox Hospital? Because when the body arrived there, Dr. Ernest Esikoff was there. And when did the call come? Did the call to Esikoff come to get to the hospital before the call for the ambulance 911 emergency? Which order did it come? Did they call the emergency first, then the family doctor, or did they make sure that the family doctor was at a particular hospital and Andrew Hoffman sent the body to that hospital, because then it was received in the hands of Dr. Esikoff and pronounced dead officially at 12:20, even though it was dead at 11:15 and was alive minutes before, still warm, and there was an hour lapse before this cast of characters went into operation. Conchita Pierce was called, Andrew Hoffman, and Dr. Ernest Esikoff. And then Esikoff goes to Dr. Michael Baden, who's the chief coroner, who was the witness before the House Select Committee, the chief medical advisor for the CIA committee of G. Robert Blakey, who covered up the assassination one more time of President John F. Kennedy. If he's capable of covering up the Kennedy assassination and a $6 million investigation, he's capable of covering up the murder of Nelson Rockefeller, who is no longer useful. He's expendable, and all of his associates had thrown him away. Even Mr. Brzezinski, I don't believe, was at that funeral. I didn't read that he was, and I've been trying to go through the newspapers and find it, and I can't find out where Brzezinski was at the time of the funeral of Rockefeller. There are some hard questions to ask, and I'm going over this really slowly because I want it to sink in that this, right in front of your eyes, is a Chappaquiddick. There are many people who've been taking these tapes and have kept up with my research in the last several years, but have not had a chance to hear me explain the Chappaquiddick, and haven't read the little bit I've written about it. I haven't written enough on Chappaquiddick, and 1969 seems a long time ago. This is 10 years later, so I have to make the comparisons between Chappaquiddick, the same effect it has on the elections, and the way that these politicians are manipulated through the bedroom as well as through the rifle scope. Now, there are questions on the Rockefeller affair which I want you to consider. Why didn't they go to the nearest hospital? Why did they have to go to Lenox Hospital instead of St. Clair or Roosevelt Hospital? Who called Rocky's doctor, as I said before, and when did they call him? Why did Megan Marshack call to get a chauffeur when there was no chauffeur around? A big answer to this puzzle is the house on 25 West 54th Street that Conchita Pierce lives in with Megan Marshack. I think you have to take the rent that these girls pay at this high-priced territory, just doors from Nelson Rockefeller, between 5th and 6th Street in New York City, and you have to take their salary, and you have to add up what their expenses were, and find out if this is a Tony Lasowitz type of Watergate safe house. Are these just two innocent girls, women, living in New York City that earn so much money that they can live two doors from Rockefeller, or are there more women living at that house? Is it a large house run such as Bobby Baker and Lyndon Johnson used to have, or Reverend Moon has put up women with politicians? This Ted Patrick, the deprogrammer, has said that the reason the congressman won't do anything about the cults or the Moonies and the operations that they're doing is that they have places in Washington, D.C., and I guess New York too, and hotel rooms and music and women of all kinds and food, and they get the congressman to bed, photograph them and tape record them, and then the next day they play it back to them. And Ted Patrick claims that there's at least 100 men in Congress that he knows of by deprogramming certain Moonies that are in the control now because of this blackmail that has been going on. It's so rampant. So I think a big answer is take the salary of Marshack and Pierce, or the many women living in there, find out their source of income, where they work, or their taxes, and what kind of a house is it, and find out if it's a CIA safe house used for blackmailing. Is it the kind where they take these photographs in the wall? Is it a kind where they can send women out that can even kill, inject, and poison food in advance that Miss Marshack was to serve? Did they have the keys to Rocky's house? Was there anything in the food or wine that he would take, that he would die quickly, and it would simulate a heart attack? I think these things have to be solved, and I think the location of these two women in that high-priced locale, just several doors from where Rockefeller lived, would be an interesting question. At 9 o'clock he goes there and picks up a phone, and she comes running down the street in her little black gown. And it would be interesting to note what kind of a residence that is at 25 West 54th Street in New York City. I asked some questions last week at the bottom of the sheet, page 2, side 2 of tape 374. I asked questions about Megan Marshack, and they weren't answered that week, and now we'll try to answer some of those questions the best we can. I asked how old she was and how long did she know Nelson Rockefeller, because the very first story of respectability was 31 years of age, an associate that worked 4 years with him on an art book. Then later they said she was 21 years of age. Would make a difference because then she started working for him when she was 17. But they compromised and found a birth date, October 1953, which makes her 25 and very respectable, not too young and not too old, but 25 years old. So the answer is, even though there were all these discrepancies, and Hugh Murrow, the press secretary of Nelson Rockefeller, was giving them out, he was sitting with this woman from the time Rockefeller died, and at least up through 4 a.m. in the morning in her apartment. So there didn't have to be any discrepancies, and he should have known pretty well who Nelson Rockefeller was with. The question, how long did she know Rockefeller? All we have found out, or I found out in the last week, is the Associated Press said that she worked for them for 6 months. There hasn't been any more about the art book. There hasn't been anything about what he was writing or the project. There are just some articles that she came from Van Nuys, California, and lived in California. There is actually no date that she met him since the first cover story, and no length of time and no indication that of an art book. The manuscript that he was leaning over when he died obviously is questionable, but how long she worked for him or where she knows Conchita Pierce, I didn't even ask that last week. We don't know. Where did she work before meeting him? She worked in Van Nuys, California, at newspaper work. I asked the question, is she a J. Walter Thompson girl? Did she come out of the same ilk as a Terry Buford? Is she part of the Rocky team or Donald Segretti's? Where did this woman come from in California, and where is she going next? What kind of a job is she going to get? Is there any connection of her to the Tim Stone, Stanford, Jonestown connections, or the UCLA, Ronald Reagan connections, the plans for those secret electrode implants on prisoners and poor blacks? Being as she comes from Van Nuys, California, which is very close to the working base of the whole Reagan machinery, and she's right there in with Rocky and ready to leave within the next 2 weeks. She was to leave in 2 weeks, and within 3 weeks of 1 week from her leaving, Reagan was to set up his headquarters for his campaign for presidency. I think we have to know more about her California base. I asked last week where she came from, but we don't really know much about how long she worked for him. I also asked, was this a casual affair where they were just caught, or was she sent with a purpose having greater repercussions? And I'll go a little more into this on the other side of this tape, but you know by my mentioning the types of motives for killing him that I believe that there are more serious repercussions. Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is side 2 of tape number 375. Persons on important committees. people who are in positions of power where their life or death makes a very big difference. Every single one of those, it should be mandatory that they have autopsy. I think was opposed to Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan and John Connally. He had political cliques, Kissinger versus Brzezinski, Cyrus Vance versus Brzezinski. There are big power stakes here. Oil companies, Connally Oil versus Standard Oil, Texas Oil, Mr. Bush running for president, the Texas Oil versus the Standard Oil, or the Royal Dutch Shell, the Queen Juliana and Prince Bernhard, a former Nazi, a board of directors of IG Farben, makers of chemical death and poisons all over the world. When you're dealing with people that have deciding opinions in major policies or even small policies, if there's a question of death, if a man has taken out a insurance policy and his wife dies quickly and he gets the money, I think in every one of these cases, the mate shouldn't have the decision, and particularly public figures. They get the privileges that go with being public figures. He gets the privilege of being the vice president. They get the home, they get the protection, the transportation, and all the fringe benefits public officials get with being in public office. And all of a sudden, they keel over, and the wife says, or the husband could say, if it's a woman who's in public life, I want him cremated. I don't think that person has the decision. I don't think Mr. and Mrs. Kopechny have the right to say, don't autopsy my daughter, because she was with and in the car of a man who was going to run for president of the United States in 1972. If she wants to party with these people, then she has to be cut up when she's dead for autopsy purposes to see if there's poison in their stomach. There's an article in the paper this week along those lines, and then we'll get back to Rockefeller, about a airplane crash that took place just at the time of the elections, before the last elections in Virginia. Mr. Aubenchain, 42 years old, died, and he was running, Richard D. Aubenchain. He was a candidate for the Republicans for Virginia, and in the primaries, he was running against Mr. Warner, Elizabeth Taylor's husband. Warner was Secretary of the Navy. He has been opposing the appointment of black judges in Virginia that Jimmy Carter wanted. He claims that the way he won the election over Mr. Miller, this final election, was because he came out staunchly for segregation in the Navy when he was Secretary of the Navy. He's a known racist. He was in charge of Richard Nixon's Bicentennial Committee, a known racist, going backwards, way back before the Civil Rights days. And he lost in the primary to Mr. Aubenchain, and Aubenchain won in the primary as the Republican candidate. And just this week in the newspaper, this last week, Associated Press article said a pilot error was blamed in the crash that killed the candidate for Senate. The airplane crash that killed Virginia Republican senatorial candidate Richard Aubenchain was caused by a pilot error and misjudgments of the pilot, that he made a visual landing in cloudy weather with too little experience. Now, the investigation was done. Killed was Aubenchain, 42, Richard Neal, 42, of Alexander, Virginia, co-owner of the plane. Another man, Robert Edelton, 28, a flight instructor. They were all killed, plus the pilot. But the investigation says they don't know the name of the pilot. The investigators could not determine who was piloting when it crashed. Now, when you take the plane apart and you can pinpoint the fault to the pilot, you can at least know when the plane was registered who went out with that plane. All of them were deceased. They don't have the name of a deceased man. They say the pilot was at fault. Did he have parents? Did he have a wife? Couldn't you say, my husband was out that day with the candidate? No, the name is withheld. Why? Would it be linked to a spy operation? Was he one of these zombies, a kamikaze? Were the controls off? It's funny that 4 people were murdered, and then as soon as he was dead, Mr. Warner comes in and says, well, I'll run for Republican as a senator. And then he won, and he won because by about 8,000 votes, because he brought out the fact that he wanted segregation in the Navy as Secretary of the Navy. So that's the kind of world we're facing, and that's why autopsies are important, and truth is important. Truth about who the pilot was and how he got there and how four were killed, to manipulate this kind of election chicanery so that the Senate, one way or another, through one death or another, can have a whole string of fascists. That's the way Hitler got elected in 1933. The choices are limited. It's like an article that was in the Washington Post in October 78, October 2nd, and I've done 3 tapes on the Pope John Paul II. But the article, big article in the New York Times, Vatican criticized for lack of autopsy. And the article said that in the modern era, Cardinal Eugene Tisserand of France, Dean of the Sacred College of the Cardinals, believed that his patron, Pope Pius XI, was murdered. When Pius XI died in 1939, Tisserand contended he was about to denounce the Vatican's 1929 Concordat with Italy's fascist government. So the whole Catholic Church could swing along with Mussolini and go along with fascism. And Tisserand had said that Pope Pius XI was murdered, and then Tisserand fell out of a building. After that, this article doesn't go on to talk about Tisserand also being pushed out of a building, but the article goes into the possibility of poison as an instrument of the government of the Vatican. Now, the Washington Post, October the 2nd, 1978, is quoting people saying that poison is an instrument of the Vatican. Then why can't it be an instrument of the Republican Party in 1979 in the apartment of Nelson Rockefeller? As I said before, Dr. Michael Baden was the man before the House Select Committee, the chief of the medical panel. If you want to look up your tapes or your testimony, it'll be printed soon. It was September the 7th that he testified before the House Select Committee. And now he's saying about Nelson Rockefeller as the head examiner of New York City, no indication that any crime was committed. Now that's what Dr. Baden is saying without examining even the arm of Dr. Rockefeller to see if he was given a shot of cyanide. Remember the headlines down in Jonestown that 910 people committed suicide. Then the doctor went in later and corrected it and said 900 people were murdered. And then he said he examined 70 people and 30 of them had needle marks in their arms. He didn't say if the other 40 were shot in the leg. They were covered up with blankets, and Mark Lane said he heard 89 rounds of shot, and there were men with guns there pointed at them if they didn't take the poison. Baden said there is no indication of any crime committed. How can there be an indication? I am sure if the body was supposed to be cremated on Monday and they hurried it up and did it on Saturday, that there must have been some indication, because there's an article January 29th, 1979, Rockefeller's body is cremated one day earlier than expected. That they originally were going to cremate him on Monday, but there was no explanation why the body was cremated one day earlier than planned. Well, when you get a discrepancy of where he was and who he was with and who was called and who was there to receive him, and a specific doctor was sent there who ordered the cremation and nobody knows how he got there, I'm sure Michael Baden isn't looking for a crime. As I say, if he covers up the killing of the president, he can do it here. He said, we have not asked the district attorney to investigate. The Manhattan district attorney, Robert Morgenthau, I know him and know his work. He's not notorious for looking into any of the crimes in New York City. He's part of that clique in there that anything goes, bring in the next corpse. This is the type of judicial system we have from California to New York. Baden said, we're not going to investigate this. He said the hour delay might have caused death, but we can't do anything about that now because the body is cremated. If I sound a little outraged, forgive me. I have no love for Nelson Rockefeller. This is no great obituary on Nelson Rockefeller, but we all suffer by this kind of escalation of death because, you see, if this keeps going on, and I think it's gotten too far out of hand, it's sort of like the story of the killer bees coming from Brazil. I don't think we'll ever be able to have an election where, or have any good person exist that can stop us anymore from seeing them killed. I sincerely believe that. Mort Saul wrote in his book Heartland why he referred to me, and he said, well, how many people have to die before they listen to Mae Brussell? And I think that's a good question. I don't think any person who's decent, any person who runs for any office, or a decent witness has a chance to survive anymore. I think too much has gone down the drain, and unless we get out in the streets and demonstrate and show our outrage like the Muslims are doing over in Iran now, showing outrage to American exploitation, there's no way to stop the killings. I think anybody who is part of these conspiracies also has no chance of surviving. I think Rockefeller is totally expendable. I think that good people such as Pope John Paul I, gentle people or kind people or good politicians, don't have a chance. Anybody who wants to affect a social change is killed. I wrote 1972 in my article on Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped and American Assassins. I wrote it again in 73. In The Realist, the Senate Select Committee is part of the cover-up, and again in 1974, the SLA is the CIA. Anybody who's decent goes down the drain, and I think the killers just have too much going now. There's too many teams. They have the media behind them, and the way they get the media behind them is to get the man with the girlie, and then they call that, in quotes, being discreet. There's absolutely no reason why this district attorney in New York City can't ask more questions about, for example, how the doctor got there, if the doctor got there before the emergency was called, is this a safe house, did these girls have any contact with intelligence operations, did they either work for the CIA or FBI or the defense agencies, who did they work for before? The Associated Press is a cover for the CIA from Ms. Marshack, but Conchita Pierce, where did she come from when she got her job in New York City? She's totally innocent, and if she's innocent and she called the chauffeur, why wasn't the chauffeur there? The time discrepancies I asked about last week, calling the ambulance. Marshack was alone with Rocky. As I say before, maybe she can't dress him. Maybe they're both, she can dress herself, but she can't dress him, but she calls Conchita. And that the possibilities in the time discrepancy are about 3 or 4. Maybe, as I say, a girly party and she gets some help. But that doesn't make sense because the chauffeur would have come in. If they dressed him, she could have dressed him herself, I should think, and then call the ambulance. I can't believe that the hour lapse wasn't anything except what it was supposed to be, an hour lapse, and we haven't seen a thing about Lonnie Wiltshire, the chauffeur, or the 2 security guards that were with him, or why Hugh Murrow covered up, and this long series of lies on the part of all of them has to be more than just covering up Rocky's cheating on his wife, because the cremation, the early cremation, and the arrogance with which the politicians are treating it makes it a political act. There was no grief, there's total embarrassment, and everyone's staying away from it. And I think that this is important to think about and think about constantly. If Miss Megan Marshack was moving to California in 2 weeks, did she know? Was that her next assignment? Just like these very important people, Tim Stone, Grace Stone, Terry Buford, the people that handled the money for the People's Temple, the defectors, 17 of them now represented by a CIA attorney, they knew to get out. A whole bunch of them died, but the people that set up the bank accounts, they knew when to get out, didn't they? The Carter brothers and several other people, they heard the shooting and the screaming and the crying, and they went back and took the money out of their Burnham Prime Minister's wife flies in with a plane and takes away money or documents before the bodies are marked or evacuated. They knew where to go and get the money. They admitted they have it. They knew how to move in that direction. And I think that the Rockefeller story is the same kind of story to check Conchita and check Eskatoff. And I just keep saying it over and over again because I think there's more to them than we know right now. Alexander Cockburn has an article in the Village Voice, which I received from friends in New York, really grateful for that, February 5th, 1978. I don't really like Cockburn, but I like his writing style. And I want to just give you about 2 sentences from his article. He says, never bigger than at the moment of death, so greedy for life, he managed to snatch an extra 60 minutes posthumously, and Nelson Rockefeller left at least one legacy, and he goes into that time-honored ritual of working late at the office that many wives will be dubious now about these 25-year-olds in long black dresses waiting at the other end. But the important thing that comes up in this article, in addition to asking the questions about Dr. Ernest Esikoff of who summoned him and when the call came that he was at the hospital when he died, he makes a comment here about the sequence of death, and he says this: I dare say that if Jimmy Carter discussed the matter with Tong Sai-ping, the latter might have responded that similar uncertainties attended the death of Lin Pao. Lin Pao was working with Mao Zedong in China and was killed in an airplane crash. And I had said for many, many years in my research that Lin Pao was murdered so that this other team could take over the government in China. And Cockburn compares Rockefeller's death to Lin Pao. Then he goes on, certainly John Paul II could have confirmed from Mexico that contradictory statement following the death of his predecessor, John Paul I, you may recall. First stated by the Vatican, he was reading Thomas à Kempis when he died with a smile on his face. Later he had a heart attack reading unpleasant bureaucratic memorandum. Still later they said he was poisoned by a nun. I mentioned Pope John Paul I, and the important thing here is the time sequence, that what Cockburn is talking about. Rockefeller dies February 26 in New York City. It is the beginning of the weekend and the celebrations in Washington, D.C. of the Chinese Prime Minister with Jimmy Carter, and Carter is partying there, and Carter is entertaining a man who came to power through murders of his own associates in China. Then he's referring to Pope John Paul II, who's off in Mexico simultaneously, who became the Pope because of the murder of Pope John Paul I. But the important thing about Mr. Tong's visit is his violent anti-Soviet, let's go to war against Russia stance. The important thing about Pope John Paul II is he's in Mexico with his violent anti-Soviet stance, picking on the Soviets and telling the church people don't get radical or politicized and mind your own business, but let's go after the Soviet Union. So what you get is a team coming into Washington. If Reagan or Connally or General Haig or Bush get in, George Bush, and I think it'll be Reagan because, as I say, I think they selected him a long time ago. And when you get the czarist Nazi team from Stanford Research, the people from Stanford Research such as Tim Stone that set up the Jonestown drug control, set up Jim Jones when he came home from Brazil up in Mendocino, Ronald Reagan managed by Paul Lassault, a direct representative of Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes wanted him to be President of the United States, but he represents used aircraft, satellites, spy planes, Nevada, Intertel, you name it, Interpol, Intertel. When you combine Reagan and Lassault and Stanford Research with the headquarters of the Hitler Nazi Gehlen operation and the czarists that have been trying to do in Russia all the time, when you get that triangle, when you get Reagan in there at one end and Mr. Tong in China ready to make war against Russia, and then at the other end you have the entire Catholic population heated up by the Pope, and you realize that every single one of these triangles that is spreading all over the world will spread like a disease called the Fourth Reich, have accumulated power identical to the way Hitler came to power. As Seymour Melman said in his book on the way Hitler came to power, and I quote it many times, you had the political assassination of 400 political leaders before Adolf Hitler could really, in 1933, declare his total dictatorship. And this is what you're facing now. We're on the brink right now of World War III, of the Fourth Reich. I really believe it. I've seen it for a long time. And I think the Rockefeller story fits right into the script, right this time. And I think it's something for you to consider. The triangle of power that's building up, the power base of China, on the one hand, with Mr. Tong visiting used aircraft, Boeing aircraft up in Seattle, with Senator Jackson, lashing out, using the White House for a platform against the Soviet Union, representing all those people in China, and the Pope coming to Mexico and representing the might of the Catholic Church with the best PR job I've ever seen. Get your scissors and whatever paper you have, cut out articles on the Pope. I've got more on him than Chappaquiddick, Chowchill, and Patty Hearst combined already, and he's only been a Pope for a few months. He is getting press coverage, full pages, all over the world in every paper. Kissing babies, wearing his little Mexican hat, doing his little human trip, but mouthing something very, very serious that came just prior to World War II, and you've got a team there if you get Reagan into that seat of power, and that's what he's gunning for. You have a triangle there of this huge might of China, the Catholic Church, and of course Reagan works with Bennett and Mullen and the Mormon Church and Paul LaSalle. So you have the weight of the entire Mormon Church with their data banks going back to the year 600, the genealogy of everybody, and a record of everybody, their political thinking. They'll know who to screen out, who to accept, and who to rule out. So you have this triangle of power that is very, very strong. And I think that's the significance of wiping Rocky out at this time, is to secure that triangle base, and that's just exactly what they did. Now, Rocky was no great flaming liberal, don't get me wrong. I mean, this is a man who used family wealth to squeeze out every single person. He left that state totally bankrupt after being governor for 4 years. Used Chase Manhattan to squeeze out small farmers, multiplied his profits over the deaths of small people. Don't forget his murdering of 41 people up at Attica, which was totally unforgivable. It was just his little war, his private war, to show that he wasn't the liberal Republican, that he was conservative like the others. He helped with Henry Kissinger to overthrow Salvador Allende and put the Nazis into power. He's played footsie with every Latin American dictatorship for oil and profit and exploitation. He moves people around as if they're men on a chessboard. Countries are pawns. I'm not praising him. He's used that miserable German scumbag Henry Kissinger, who I never believed was Jewish, but who worked with the Nazis in Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, Guatemala, Greece, and with Sadat of the Borman Brotherhood. I think that's one of the biggest hoaxes of the 20th century, this hugging and kissing of Kissinger and Rockefeller, and then planning Nazis as heads of state. I don't accept it, and he employed Nancy Rockefeller under salary before she married Henry. He set up these committees like the Trilateral, the Bilderberger, the Council of Foreign Relations, that take the decisions away from Congress. We can't send a man back there and tell him what we want. They tell Congress what they want. And the people in the United States have no decisions over their health or their savings or their food, whether it's going to be poisoned or not, or their housing or their education or their recreation, or what they see on the big tube. These oil companies take over the sponsored KQED and the listener-sponsored stations. Everything is mobile. Exxon, and you watch these situation comedies or comedies about royalty. I call them comedies. They're boring, but they're comedies because they're so outdated. He imported Nazis after World War II. The Nuremberg trial wouldn't even touch them. Rockefeller used his headquarters for the spy headquarters. He covered up the assassination of John F. Kennedy, just that alone, and other political leaders when he headed as vice president, the committee appointed by Gerald Ford to cover up these murders. And he hired David Bellin, that CIA crook from the Warren Commission, with his twinkling, winking eye and his little bow tie, to be his chief investigator, chief counsel, to cover up for the Rockefeller Committee. What did he get for all this? What did he get for covering up the murder of foreign leaders, for covering up the murder of John Kennedy, for Chappaquiddick, covering up that? You know, all the investigations that he could have pushed for putting his Nazis into office all over the world. What did he get out of it? He got a Chappaquiddick like Ted Kennedy, and I guess there's a lesson in that for all of us, and I hope you heed it, because it's a good lesson on power and how power doesn't protect. I think that's the important thing, is that wealth, hundreds of millions of dollars, don't protect. You can read about all of the money that he accumulated and inherited, invested, and stole. Rockefeller Oil wanted to control all of the oil of the world by 1890. And they went on in and dealt with Nobel Oil and the oil fields in the Ukraine And George de Mohrenschildt worked with Nelson Rockefeller, and his father ran the Nobel oil fields for the Tsar in Russia. What did it get him? Nothing. It got him a Chappaquiddick affair. It got him a girl for the night. It got him a death and an hour wait and no ambulance, no identification. He died like a dog, just like any other person. He could stand for nothing except his art collections and his profits. As I say, he was the governor. He certainly left it in bad shape. At least Jerry Brown, a lot of people criticize Jerry Brown out here, but he's got a surplus of money in case of emergencies, and as yet he hasn't called in troops to gun down certain prisoners. I'm not campaigning for one over the other, but it's disgusting to use that education and that money and then think, that he could get away with what he did. A lot of people are doing the same thing that Nelson Rockefeller did, and they're getting away with it. They don't all get a little Chappaquiddick affair, but comes election year, if you're in the way of a candidate, you're going to get it. Or if you know too much, you're going to get it. There's a woman that worked for George Smathers, this Mary Jo Kopechne, who had to die in order to keep Ted Kennedy from running for president in 1972. And Carol Taylor, her roommate, worked for Bobby Baker. And of course she went under in the Atlantic Ocean. The two girls both died. She was a woman that set up all kinds of contracts and whoring arrangements for Bobby Baker, call houses, and so forth for politicians before Reverend Moon moved into town. Then the Moonies took over, and other people too. It's still going on. But in The Realist, I wrote in 1973 the motives for this kind of operation. I said it's impossible, the way the courts are constructed, to force any revelations that would damage the existing power structure. If Richard Nixon moves out of office, and this was the summer of 73, Spiro Agnew moves in. Now this was in the summer of 73 before Agnew was pulled out by Richard Nixon. Right after this was published in the summer of 73, Richard Nixon began to get Spiro Agnew out of office because he realized that if he was there at the same time as Nixon, I'm sure he knew that Nixon would be killed and Agnew would become the president. I wrote for The Realist that after Agnew, Ronald Reagan will follow him, and I stated in the Realist article, the depth of corruption and link to the sabotage will not be touched. A power base of manipulations and political dishonesty which funds all these men remain. And I cited in this article interests such as ITT, Howard Hughes oil companies, and warfare contractors and aerospace industries and so forth that really have the hold over the White House, the presidency, and the vice presidency. And once in a while we get a man in there, such as Jimmy Carter, who is also linked to the warfare industries, he graduated from Annapolis, don't forget, and ran atomic submarines. He's not detached from the warfare, but Reagan was a selected man, and I feel very strongly that the people that want Reagan as President of the United States have created a situation whereby Rockefeller could be killed and disposed, and the case is closed. And as I say, I think this condition has gone so far that we're helpless, and we have to sit back and just watch the whole thing take place. Well, that's it for this week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and I'll be with you next Friday, and you take care.